I feel threatened?
Evolution. It's not a scientific law or a law of biology. A scientific law must be 100% correct.
Good, look at you go. You are correct. Evolution is not a scientific law, and scientific laws are by definition factual because they're simply the result of experiments that are shown to be how the world works through repeated observation. Okay, now keep going, and if you get just a few more things right, this is shaping up to be a very short video.
Failure to meet only one challenge proves a law is wrong.
Okay, I suppose I can grant you that an accepted scientific law can be disproven if the evidence shows that. However, by the time that an idea becomes accepted as a scientific law, it's generally been tested enough to know that if something contradicts it, it was likely just an unaccounted for variable or a poorly executed experiment.
This video will prove that the theory of evolution fails many challenges, not simply one.
Okay, I am kind of interested in seeing which so-called challenges you believe that evolution fails. However, even if it does fail your challenges, you've created a false comparison, one that, just from my simple assumption, likely comes from a lack of understanding as to the difference between a scientific law and a scientific theory. To help us out throughout the rest of this video, I'll just go ahead and explain both of them here. A scientific law is, and I quote, a statement based on repeated experimental observations that describes some aspect of the universe. It's simply a statement of what is observed. A scientific theory, on the other hand, is even above a scientific law in terms of explanatory power, as it not only makes a statement based on observation, but it also explains how and why the results that are obtained show what they do.
The theory of evolution will never become a law of science because it has many errors. This is why it is still called a theory.
I'll go ahead and take this moment here to clarify even further what the problem is that most people have when trying to understand what the theory of evolution is and what it is not. Evolution is a scientific theory. A scientific theory is very different from what is colloquially known as a theory. A colloquial theory is essentially no more than a hypothesis. While it's unfortunate that the word has taken on such a different meaning between science and common conversation, but it's simply something that people need to wrap their minds around before they're able to understand the theory of evolution. A scientific theory is not a hypothesis, but a detailed explanation of how an aspect of the universe works based on independently repeated observation and experimentation.
The process of natural selection is not an evolutionary process. DNA proves that evolution is false.
Okay. Can I get a source?
The DNA in plants and animals allows selective breeding to achieve desired results. Dogs are a good example of selective breeding. The DNA in all dogs has many recessive traits. A desired trait can be produced in dogs by selecting dogs with a particular trait to produce offspring with that trait. This specialized selective breeding can continue for generation after generation until a breed of dog is developed. Many different types of dogs can be developed this way, but they can never develop a cat by selective breeding dogs. Natural selection can never extend outside of the DNA limit.
Here we have an example of a misunderstanding of phylogeny, a field in which I was also very ignorant for quite some time until discovering Aron Ra. No, a dog will never evolve into a cat, just as a chimpanzee will never evolve into a human no matter how selectively you breed them. Cats did not evolve into dogs, and dogs did not evolve into cats, but rather dogs and cats, and all other species within the order Carnivora, including bears, raccoons, skunks, and even things like seals, share a common ancestor. Different populations of that common ancestor species then specialize for different environments or different niches within their ecosystems over the course of millions of years until eventually we have the extreme variation within the order Carnivora that we see today. Dogs and cats did not, do not, and will not evolve into one another no matter how much time they are given. Rather, they share a distinct common ancestor from which they evolved alongside one another. This can be seen between any two species in the entire phylogenetic tree. Even if you were to take the position of Kent Hovind and decide that just because it seems unintuitive that elephants and pine trees are phylogenetically related, they must not be, you are still left with the simple fact that if you classify down both elephants and pine trees back to their most basic form, they are both made of eukaryotic cells. For this reason, although they are so different now that somebody like Kent who lacks an understanding of evolution would assume that they had no similarities, elephants and pine trees do indeed share a common ancestor, however distant it may be.
DNA cannot be changed into a new species by natural selection. The same process of selective breeding is done with flowers, fruits and vegetables. New variations of the species are possible, but a new species has never been developed by science.
While this isn't a fantastic definition, the generally accepted definition of species is the largest group of organisms within which two organisms can create viable offspring through reproduction. By this definition, which I assume is the definition you're using, the only thing that would constitute a new species being developed is simply a new group of organisms that has evolved from a different species who can breed within their new species but can no longer breed within members of their previous species. Your claim that a new species has never been developed scientifically is patently false. One of the simplest explanations of this phenomena is known as a ring species. This is a concept that I will likely expand into an entire video at some point in the future, but if you look it up now, I'm sure you can find fantastic videos covering it.
In fact, the most modern laboratories are unable to produce a left-hand protein as found in humans and animals. Evolutionists fail to admit that no species has ever been proven to have evolved in any way.
See, now you've just entered an entirely new realm of crazy. You've misunderstood the simple difference between evolution of any kind and speciation. There's most certainly evidence for both, however, even people like Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis accept that microevolution occurs. This is because the evidence for microevolution is so undeniable, even just based on observations over the span of one human lifetime, that any denial of it is simply ignorance of reality. And while macroevolution or speciation is sometimes harder to see over small timescales, things like the aforementioned ring species make it very clear that macroevolution is also a fact of life.
If natural selection were true, Eskimos would have fur to keep them warm, but they don't.
Just because an adaptation may have been helpful for survival does not necessarily mean that the adaptation would have ever been mutated, or even that if it did, it would manage to survive in the gene pool long term. Modern humans are an interesting case in that despite being a product of millions of years of evolution, humans have managed to evolve the ability to think logically, to reason through problems, and to manipulate their environment in order to solve these problems to a degree that other organisms are just simply incapable of right now. For this reason, the selective pressure for Eskimos to evolve thick hair was not nearly as strong as it would have been in other species. While evolving thick hair would have certainly helped people in cold climates to survive the extreme temperatures, it was simpler for humans to, rather than wait for a helpful mutation to come along and become prevalent in the gene pool, simply instead use their surroundings, like animals who already had developed thick hair as well as their innovative architecture, in order to make the most of the little heat that they did have. Had humans not previously evolved the ability to reason through these problems, they would have had no choice but to wait for a helpful mutation or die out due to an inability to cope with the conditions.
Humans in the tropics would have silver, reflective skin to help them keep cool, but they don't.
I'm unable to find where you would actually be getting the information to make this claim. However, I will take this moment to explain to you a little bit about skin color and surviving in an environment. The hotter and sunnier a place that people live in, the more UV light they're going to have to withstand coming from the sun. The pigment in human skins that protects against UV light the most is called melanin, and as such, the hotter and sunnier your environment, the more useful increased melanin would be. Melanin is a brown-black pigment, and as you get closer to these hotter climates, you find people with darker skin, as their skin is simply an advantageous adaptation in order to help them deal with their given environments. God, I'm starting to lose hope here. Hopefully your next section will actually be factual in some way.
Evolution is scientifically impossible.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Evolution is a theory developed 140 years ago by Charles Darwin, actually by his grandfather before Charles was even born.
This claim was rather surprising to me when I first heard it in this video. I was ready to just write it off as nonsense, however, I decided I might as well research it a little bit for myself and find out. As it turns out, Darwin's grandfather did actually have some sort of vague idea about different living things being related and having come from common ancestors. However, his understanding of the subject was comparably very vague and unsubstantiated scientifically. On the other hand, his grandson, who may or may not have based some of his preliminary ideas on the ideas of his grandfather, actually did all the scientific research to prove it, and figured out the mechanism by which evolution occurs, that being natural selection. That aside, even if Darwin's grandfather were to have made all the discoveries only to have them stolen by his grandson, which is most certainly not the case, it would do nothing at all to falsify the theory of evolution. Next, I figure I should probably address the pathetic Darwin quote mine about the human eye that you decided to use in your slide. To be honest, I'm not even sure whether the specific misuse of this quote was done in malice or simply in ignorance, as this quote is used most often by creationists and other science deniers in an attempt to discredit evolution. While the section of the quote that is shown seems to imply that even Darwin himself thought the eye was irreducibly complex, in the full quote he goes on to say that, despite it seeming absurd, it could no doubt have happened given adequate time and the correct conditions through gradual improvements brought about through natural selection. And finally, even if that quote was not mined and Darwin really did believe that the eye could not have evolved by natural selection, we now know for a fact that it can, and can even demonstrate the exact process by which it would happen. A great example of this is presented by a young Richard Dawkins and will be linked in the description. One of the differences between scientists and religious prophets is that it is completely okay to accept some ideas of a scientist that were correct while rejecting others that were false. While somebody may have been the specific one to bring an idea into the public light, they are not an absolute authority on it and can absolutely be corrected years later when new evidence emerges. God damn it, all of that ranting was just based on one PowerPoint slide. Next.
At that time, science did not have evidence available to prove the theory false. His famous book on the origin of species by means of natural selection has a title that is now known to be scientifically false.
I would dignify this with a detailed response explaining why you were incorrect in every way while you make that statement. However, you didn't seem to think that your point was even good enough to bother supporting it with even a single piece of evidence, so I will simply respond in a way that you might understand. Nuh-uh, because reasons!
Life did not start with a bolt of lightning striking a pond of water, as claimed by the mainstream scientists. Kids are taught that life can evolve given enough time. This is a false statement without any scientific support.
First of all, just because you oversimplify a concept just based on your own inability to understand it or your desire to mislead people does not make your statement true. Provide some evidence. Secondly, what you're referring to is not evolution. You're talking about abiogenesis, an idea that is not in the slightest required to be understood in order to have evolution be proven true.
Time does not make impossible things possible. As an example, a computer was programmed in an attempt to arrive at a simple 26-letter alphabet. After 35 trillion attempts, it has only arrived at 14 letters correctly.
What that particular experiment is missing, however, is the very thing that makes evolution work, the central concept that explains how and why evolution happens: natural selection. Without natural selection, evolution would not work in any positive way except by chance. However, when you add an understanding of a mechanism that chooses which genes get passed down based on which ones are beneficial, it absolutely makes sense. Your analogy does not work.
The educational system teaches children not to think. Any student who uses logic and solid scientific evidence to question the theory of evolution is ridiculed and insulted into submission.
If any student is ridiculed and insulted by an educator for asking a question, that is not a product of science and the truth that it shows, but rather a product of a really shitty educator. Questions are central to science. Without questions, science would have no application. Questions are encouraged in science, both because they help people to understand difficult and complex topics, as well as because they can lead to new understandings and ideas, and even new fields of science that didn't exist before the question was asked.
Children are brainwashed by teaching them there is no absolute right or wrong. This results in children who are unable to think logically and scientifically.
Even if I were to grant you this pathetic attempt at an unsubstantiated point appealing to emotion, what does this have to do with the truth of evolution? You know, evolution, the thing that you claim to be debunking.
The evolutionist will claim that the presence of many individual species proves evolution. This shallow statement is devoid of reason, logic, and scientific proof.
Yes it is. And that's precisely why you will never hear a scientist use it. What you've just created is called a straw man. You know that you can't legitimately combat the actual positions of the people you disagree with, so instead you manufacture a silly statement that you like to think they would say in order to actually have something to refute.
Evolutionists line up pictures of similar-looking species and claim they evolved one from another. The human family tree is an example of this flawed theory. Petrified skulls and bones exist from hundreds of species of extinct monkeys and apes. Evolutionists line up the most promising choices to present a gradual progression from monkey to modern man.
There are very meticulous reasons for the ways that scientists line up the remains of different species. While many of these reasons are clearly visible, such as gradual changes in size between species, others are much more subtle and require a more trained eye to actually see and understand. Just because you do not personally understand why they are lining things up in a certain way does not mean that they don't actually have legitimate reasons to do so.
They simply fill in the big gaps with make-believe creatures to fit the picture. This procedure can be done with humans only because there are many extinct monkeys and ape species. They never do this with tigers or elephants or any other animal. Darwin admitted that fossils of the transitional links between species would have to be found in order to prove his theory. Well, these transitional links have never been found. We only find individual species.
Either there is no such thing as a transitional species, or all species are transitional species. These are your two options, and neither one proves your point. Take your pick. Fossils can be shown to be intermediary between different species and can then be confirmed to have existed between the times of the other two species. If a species has not been found that shows a link between two different species, predictions can and are accurately made to show what these fossils should look like and where they should be found. A fantastic recent example of this process is Tiktaalik, the link between fish and amphibians.
Let me show you what happens when you ask one of the crazy evolutionists to explain evolution.
Much to everybody's dismay, we will sadly have to see your example as a part 2, as you are so wrong in every claim that you make that I'm only 5 minutes into your quote-unquote debunk and already have almost a 20-minute video to upload, and sadly, I'm not sure I trust my shitty internet to actually manage anything larger. Regardless, I hope everybody enjoyed listening to this man's crazed ramblings as much as I did. Hopefully you learned something and will be back for part 2 as soon as I can bring myself to continue. Either way, thank you all very much for watching. Be sure to check out my video about the God Is Not Good merch shop, which will be launching in the next week or so if you missed it. And as always, have a blessed day, fellow heathens.